thank you, Tanya, for giving me a couple of minutes to give my welcome. I'm Andy Klein. I am the dean here at the Wake Forest University School of Law, and I just wanted to take a minute to add my welcome to all of you attending here live and those who are watching on Zoom as well. Some of you may know this is my first year here at Wake Forest University. And among the things that attracted me to Wake Forest when I came was the caliber of our students, the way that our faculty support those wonderful students, and the opportunity to be at a university that lives by its motto of pro humanitate, or for humanity. And really, if you think about it, it's hard to imagine a better example of all of that than a program like the one we're holding today. You know, our symposium today has been organized by some really, really talented students. And I wish I could shout out every single student on the Wake Forest Law Review. I really do. But let me specially compliment our two symposium editors, Gabby Korb and Grace General. Where's Gabby and Grace? Can you raise your hands? How about a round of applause? You guys, seriously, you guys have done an awesome job. And I also want to thank my colleague, Professor Tanya Marsh. Tanya also serves as our Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. She helped guide these terrific students. She's one of the nation's leading experts on funeral law and death care, and she helped bring us a really A-plus top flight group of speakers today. So a big round of applause for Tanya. And, you know, I'll also note the issues we're talking about today at the symposium are really important topics. We're talking about aspects of law that protect people at what can be the most difficult times in their lives. So what our panelists are talking about really matter. And the fact that we've got hundreds of people, I think almost 600 people live and online combined signed up for the symposium, that suggests that Dean Marsh and our students really hit the mark in what they did. So thanks to all our speakers who joined us. Thanks to all of you who are here for the symposium. I hope many of you will stay well connected with the school and our outstanding students. And thank you for giving me a minute to welcome.
My name is David Harrington, and I'm glad to be moderating this panel on licensing funeral directors. I'm over here because I'm going to use PowerPoint slides, and I forgot to bring a copy of my PowerPoint slides with me, so I've got to be able to see the screen. And my other people on the panel are from your left to right. We've got Dr. Harry Close II, and he's founder and CEO of Harry Close Funeral Services in Baltimore. Then next to him is Renée Flaherty, and she's a senior attorney at the Institute for Justice, which is a nonprofit legal think tank and activist group in terms of promoting the right to earn a living type cases. And next to her is Caressa Hughes, who's an assistant vice president of government and industry relations at Service Corporation International. So I'm going to try to keep my comments to 10 minutes, although I'll be rushing. And then they'll all have comments for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions that I'll ask initially, but then open it up to everybody else. And so they have this magical thing that I didn't have to touch anything except this, and it came up with the first slide. So I'm amazed. So I actually created a title to this thing called Sweeping Away Licensing Requirements. What I'm going to talk about today is the case of Arizona's universal licensing law, which went into effect in the late months of 2019. It was the first of a collection of states that have enacted these laws, which are called universal licensing laws. And so wherever Victoria is, this is a case where maybe having the title university didn't create a death knell to this particular legislation. And so to give you a little background, and you've heard about some of this morning, we've got a lot of variation across states in this country on the stringency of licensing regulations for funeral directors or licensing requirements for funeral directors. about half the states have pretty stringent regulations when it comes to the licensing of funeral directors. Those states in red require all funeral directors to be licensed or to be trained as embalmers. The green states, which is about half of the states, don't have that requirement. Now, let's just think about a couple of states to give you an idea of the difference in requirements between states that require all funeral directors to be embalmers and those that don't. So interestingly, Arizona has created this new law, which is called universal licensing, it happens to have some of the most stringent regulations when it comes to funeral directors. So in Arizona, to become a funeral director in Arizona, you have to complete a 2-year mortuary science degree. Then you have to have a year apprenticeship at a funeral home. And they have this last requirement, which is unusual and going to be helpful for me. And that is you have to have had an active embalmer's license for at least a year before you can get your funeral director's license. That means it takes 3 to 4 years to become licensed as a funeral director in Arizona. Now, on the other extreme, Missouri is one of the least regulated states in the country when it comes to funeral directing, and they require you either to complete a 1-year of mortuary college, which doesn't involve training in embalming, or you have to complete a 1-year apprenticeship at a funeral home. And so if you're in Missouri, it can take as little as a year to become a licensed funeral director. Okay, now, a lot of my research over the years has been to look at the impact of these regulations on various economic outcomes. And one of the outcomes, which Caitlin basically talked about, is the dramatic increase in the proportion of women as funeral directors. And so what I did is I used the census data to essentially create the proportion of funeral directors who are women over the last 50 years. And you can see it's grown tremendously. And at the end of the process, we're about 33% of funeral directors currently are women. And that number is surely going to rise in the future. But as you can see, in the states that have stringent regulations where all funeral directors have to be trained as embalmers, you find fewer women choosing to be funeral directors in states that don't have that requirement. If you just look at the data, the difference in this raw data, the difference is about 20%. You're going to find that the number of female funeral directors is on average 20% higher in states that do not require funeral directors to be embalmers. Now, a couple of co-authors, one who I like a lot because she's my wife, wrote an article together on this. And what we did in that article was basically just do a lot of things to control for other factors that might be able to explain this difference. And basically, we couldn't shoot down the difference. The difference seems to be attributable to these regulations and not to some other third factor that we're not seeing here. So in 2019, Arizona was the first state in the nation to adopt universal occupational licensing. And this law applies to all the licensed occupations in Arizona, not just the funeral regulations. And what is it? Well, the requirements of Arizona's universal licensing law is first you have to be a resident of Arizona, but that can be a second home, right? So if you want to have a retirement home or a vacation home in Arizona and you're a funeral director, it applies to you. Then secondly, you have to be actively licensed and in good standing in another state for at least 1 year. So if you're in Missouri and you went into the profession under a more lightly regulated system, you can, after 1 year of experience, go to Arizona and say, we want a funeral director's license. They'll give you the funeral director's license, but they won't give you the embalmer's license, right? And you can have no disqualifying criminal history. So what I wanted to do was just look to see what effect we have seen from these early years of the Arizona law. Now, similar laws have already been passed in Ohio and Virginia. And if you go to the for Justice website, which Renee is associated with, they actually give you the maps of all the different laws in terms of universal occupational licensing across the country. So I think there's a couple more states beyond just Arizona, Ohio, and Virginia at this point. Okay, so so I just have these arrows saying that these funeral directors can flow into Arizona now under the universal licensing law. So what I wanted to do was try to figure out the effect of the universal licensing law in Arizona in its first few years of implementation. And here, these are just the number of active funeral directors in Arizona for each year up to the time when the universal law went into effect. And you can get this data by simply downloading it from their website, because virtually every state in the country has a license verification system. And if you know how to use those things, you can actually download the data from them. So I downloaded the data. This is the number of active funeral directors with an active license in each of these years. Now, if you think that the universal licensing law is going to have an enormous effect, we would expect this line to shoot up after 2019. Well, I was a little disappointed after doing all this work and collecting all the data, because what did I see? Not much change, right? And so I said, okay. So then I had to think, well, isn't there something else I can do? Well, there is. And that is, I went back to that requirement that said, if to get a funeral director's license, you have to be licensed as an embalmer for at least a year before you get it. Right? And so you should never see in the data anybody with a funeral director's license who doesn't already have an embalmer's license. So I just looked at the data set and I said, matched up all the names of the people who were embalmers with the people who had funeral director's licenses. And I just looked at the people that only had a funeral director's license. Now, what you should see is nobody up to 2019, and then you should start to see people coming in from out of state like Missouri. Now, it turns out there's just a handful of people that actually have only one license before 2019. We can explain that, but not in 10 minutes. So we have to come back to that at some later time. But what do you see after 2019? You see a dramatic increase in the number of people that have just a funeral director's license. So those 31 people are coming in to Arizona, presumably under the universal licensing law. I've already started to identify the 31 people, and I've got 10 of them identified so far and know exactly where they're coming from, and I'll get all 31 before I'm done. A lot of people, as people earlier in this, like Caitlin was saying, people aren't rushing into becoming funeral directors in this country. And so 31 may not seem like a big number, but there weren't that many people coming in. So 31 actually represents about 20% of the funeral directors that were licensed over those 4 years. So it's not a trivial percent. And so now, so I gave you examples of some of these people. This is Linda Baches. She was in the Arizona data as being only a funeral director, and I tracked her down. She's from Missouri, and you can go into the Missouri's licensing system, and you can find her license in Missouri. Here's another guy, Kelly Miller, and he has an Arizona license, and he comes from Indiana. Now, there's a little blurb about him which talks about the fact that he loves mountain biking, he loves the outdoors, and so he was just thrilled with the possibility of just being able to easily go to Arizona, and he got the licensing license in Arizona. So now I go back to this chart, right? This chart just shows you all the active funeral directors in Arizona for all the years from 2002 up to 2023. Just basically a few months ago. Then what I did is I took out the 31 people who we know came in via universal licensing. And that's what you get if you take them out. And so once you take them out, you know what happens as a result of them coming in. And what they came in and they represent about a 5.9% increase in the number of funeral directors. So that's evidence that this universal licensing law is actually having people come into the state. So it wasn't really going to be flat if those people didn't come in. It would have gone down a little bit if those people hadn't come in, right? 5.9% doesn't seem like a very big number. But I think it was Victoria and talking about the tax treatment. If you put your money aside, it can build over time, right? And so I said to myself, what happens if Arizona had passed this law in 2002 instead of 2019? So I did a couple of assumptions, one of which is probably not very realistic. And now I've got to figure out how to go back. And one is I made the tenure of these funeral directors equal to the tenure of people who were in the profession prior to 2019. And that's on average, funeral directors in Arizona were in the profession about 14 years. And so I assigned that to these people coming in. That's probably not realistic because these people are older coming in. So I probably should change that. And I just assume that they're coming in at a rate of 1.8% per year, which is consistent with what we see over the 4 years post the enactment of the law. And so that's what would have happened if it had occurred in 2002 instead of 2019. So you see this thing would grow over time. And that means a larger and larger fraction of Arizona's funeral directors would be coming in from out of state. Now, I don't think they like that, right? And so I think the universal licensing law creates incentives for these states to think about how stringent their funeral regulations are and want to make them a little bit less stringent so we don't have an inflow of lots of out-of-state funeral directors. And so here are my conclusions, and so I'm almost done. The effects of Arizona's universal licensing law, first, it had modest short-run increases, right? So states aren't going to be overwhelmed with funeral directors coming in under these laws, but it can have potentially large effects over time. And I think what may be the most important feature of these laws is they're creating incentives for states to think carefully about their licensing laws so that they don't end up having too stringent laws. And finally, it reduces the lock-in effect of licensing laws, increasing the well-being of funeral directors who have a strong desire to live in Arizona. So in part, the efficiency enhancements from this sort of law are borne by people like Kelly, the guy who liked mountain biking, who always dreamed of going to Arizona, and this frees him up to be allowed to do that. And I just had one more slide I wanted to show you because I'm going to ask the panelists some questions about this slide. The thing that is striking is basically the number of funeral directors in Arizona hasn't changed a twit hardly in basically the last 25 years. At the same time, the population of Arizona has increased by about a third. And so I've got some questions of how do we explain this change, right? And so now I'm going back over there because I've seen my slides and I can turn this thing off, right? Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I was going to start with Renée Flaherty from the Institute for Justice. And she's going to spend 10 minutes or so talking. And then we'll go to the other panel members.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor. And thank you everyone for inviting me to speak here. I'm a litigator at the Institute for Justice. It's a nonprofit public interest law firm. And so for about the past 10 years, I have been either observing my colleagues litigating cases involving the death care industry or litigating them myself. And although it's been a small part of what I do, honestly, it's been some of the most kind of interesting and fulfilling work that I've done. So it's exciting to be here at a conference with a bunch of people who also think this is really important. So that's great. And I had the pleasure of meeting Professor Harrington in person for the very first time last night, but he was a name that I had known for over 10 years because he has helped IJ by being an expert witness in our cases. And collecting data for us about the real world effects of stuff like funeral director licensing, because that's kind of what I want to talk about, is that licensing and regulations, I think to the regulators can sometimes feel a bit impersonal, but they have real impact, not just on families whose loved ones pass away, but also the people who want to make a living in the death care industry and helping people deal with this critical part of our lives. And the Institute for Justice works in a lot of areas, and my practice particularly focuses on property rights, which I might talk about a little bit today, but mostly on what we call economic liberty. And economic liberty is everyone's right to earn a living in the occupation of their choice, free from unreasonable interference from the government. And when you're working in the death care industry, as we've been talking about, there is a lot of red tape, and it is really difficult to enter the death care industry or to innovate in this space. And we have represented folks who want to sell caskets, but states have gone up against them saying that they need to be a licensed funeral director just to sell a casket, which is literally a box, and sometimes even a cardboard box. Like I represented a woman in Alabama in 2016 who owned a green cemetery, and she wanted to sell containers that could be used in her green cemetery. So cardboard boxes, shrouds that she sewed herself. And, you know, Alabama didn't have a problem with her green cemetery, but as soon as she tried to sell a box, they were like, no, 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 you can't sell a box because we have a financial interest in keeping that business for ourselves. And so she reached out to the Institute for Justice, and we filed a lawsuit on her behalf. And it was literally the quickest I have ever seen a defendant give up in a lawsuit. They fell over themselves saying like, we'll change the law. And they changed the law immediately. And that's a great outcome. Like, we were thrilled. But part of IJ's mission, in addition to legislative work, which we also do, is trying to create that precedent in court. So in a way, that was a little bit frustrating because we weren't able to get into court and actually litigate the case and create the precedent that could then help people both within Alabama and outside of Alabama. And so we have litigated a number of cases like that involving people who want to sell caskets. There was a big one in Louisiana in the Fifth Circuit on behalf of monks who wanted to sell like gorgeous handmade wooden caskets. The Benedictine monks, part of their mission is to, make a living and be out in the community, helping the community through things they do with their hands. And the funeral board went after them for not being funeral directors. And so we actually took that case to trial, like through a trial, which it's pretty rare for IJ cases to go to trial, and then won at the Fifth Circuit and created wonderful precedent for economic liberty that applied to more people than just the monks. And so that's our goal with strategic constitutional litigation, is to find individual plaintiffs who can be spokespeople for issues that go beyond just themselves. So we're looking for very specific people who are willing to stand up, not just for themselves, but for people all over the country who want to earn a living. So two cases that we've done recently in this space are not economic liberty cases. That they are, but they're mainly First Amendment cases, because they are on behalf of death doulas who just mainly want to talk to people about death. They're people who don't have a financial stake in selling anything to the families. People just want to talk through their options. And so there's a growing number of people who just want to help families navigate this very kind of confusing space and provide the emotional and social support that families need. And they're kind of flying under the radar right now for the most part. But the two cases are in California, and there were two women who kind of had a volunteer business where they would help families through home funerals. And the board went after them for not being licensed funeral directors. They said, you need to build, you need to work at a funeral establishment with an embalming room, like all of that kind of one size fits all regulation. And we won that case on First Amendment grounds. And it was a tremendous victory because what these people are doing mostly is just talking to people. And currently there's a case in Indiana that's basically the same thing. And it's in its very early stages, but we did win a preliminary injunction. So the woman gets to keep her business open during the pendency of the lawsuit. And hopefully it will go the same way as the California lawsuit. And I just recently filed a case in January involving a green cemetery. So it doesn't involve funeral director licensing, so I won't go into a lot of detail here. Somebody can ask me about it if they want to. But we have always worked in this space, and we will continue to do so because I think that there's going to be a lot of innovation and a lot of people trying to do really great things in this space. So the Institute for Justice is there for them.
Great. And so the next person I'll have on the far side, Caressa Hughes, give a few comments.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. That's a hard act to follow. I'm gonna talk about, well, first I'll tell you about what I do. So I've been in the industry for 30 years. I've been at SCI that long, managing all the government relations. So I am watching and monitoring and involved in all the changes to the laws. So I've seen a lot. When I first came to the company, we were talking about things that are totally different than we're talking about today. We were talking a lot about the anti-combo laws and things like that. But as you know, we've not been able to make much change there. So we've moved on. And my prior life, I was at Philip Morris. So I've got a long history in government affairs. I worked at a big lobby firm. And my dad likes to tell everybody, yeah, she was killing them at Philip Morris. Now she's got a bury them all at SCI. So that's my slogan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I know the theme here is regulation and licensure and changes need to be made. I'm hearing those themes. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the changes that I've actually seen, I've been involved in at the state level. Because as you know, the licensure is not regulated at the federal level, it's a state level regulation. And there have been some positive changes. And one of the things that I've actually personally worked on is this idea of dual licensure versus single licensure. We are a big proponent in the dual licensure. We do think there should be a funeral director only license and an embalmer license separate. We recently, I'll say we, not me, not the industry, but it was changed in Virginia recently. It wasn't because of the industry, but it was because of the Muslim community. They went to their legislator and they said, this isn't fair. We don't believe in this. It's against our religion. And it was done. And so that was a win for the industry, but it wasn't because of the industry. It was because of the religious. So that's a big issue that we continue. There's, as we heard, half the states have this dual licensure. I would say, I think every state should have a dual licensure. And so that is something that continue to work on that. One other issue that we've seen some of the states work on, and believe it or not, there are still some states that say to even transport a body, you have to be a licensed funeral director and an embalmer. And so you can imagine the other theme is it's such a staff shortage. So to be in a state where you have to have both a funeral director and embalmer to transport a body, it puts that funeral home in some dire straits. They need to be at that funeral home meeting with families. Well, now they've got to go pick up a body. So we've seen states recognize that as something that they need to fix. And so we're looking at several states have looked at creating a transportation type certification so that unlicensed personnel under the licensee can transport bodies. So that's good to see that movement. That's been very recent too, just in the last 3 years. The other thing that we are hearing a lot of talk about is the national board exam and how difficult that is. It's just I'm shocked that the passage rate is so low in many states. We did a little research, and we work with I work with a lot of attorneys, and they were like, let's just see what the passage rate is for the bar exam in Texas. Well, it's 80% in Texas passage, but for the funeral director, it's 60%. So we're like, oh, it's easier to be an attorney than it is a funeral director. That spoke volumes. So that's a problem. And so what some of the states are talking about are, is there an alternative to that national board? And they're talking about maybe like a state approved exam, as an or you take the national board or you take a state approved exam. And a lot of states have that now. And so the problem with that is, the opposition to that is, well, you can't go to another state. If you took the state exam, it's not portable. So that's the argument against that. But but states are looking at that as well because of that passage rate. The other thing they're looking at is the length of time you have to go to mortuary school. And we've heard that today, that sometimes it's 3 years, anywhere between 1 to 3 years, you have to go to mortuary school. So we're looking at the length of time for that. Also, apprentice, how long you have to serve your apprenticeship. Again, 1 to 3 years. How long should that be? And so all of these things are all being discussed because of this workforce shortage. So, I keep saying it took something critical for us to talk about it. And I do see that the workforce shortage is critical. I mean, we don't have enough funeral professionals to work in all of our funeral homes. And have a dramatic shortage across the whole US. So, and Caitlin, you gave the statistic that, and it was eye-opening that there's 5,500 jobs in the funeral profession a year with only 1,500 people graduating from mortuary schools. So that puts it in perspective. The other thing is the cremation certification. We're seeing states now require a certification. I think that's a good thing. And one thing that's interesting is they are specifically mentioning CANA in their law. ICCFA also has a program, they mention them. So they're being very specific about where you get your certification. I find that very interesting. And so that's really, we're watching hundreds of bills. Just, in case you're wondering, there's probably about 500 bills a year that pass. We're in 45 states, so there's 5 states I don't know about, but there's 45 states that we actually have about 500 bills that we put on the books and communicate out that are passing, that are specifically relating to our industry. And about 20% of those will have a pretty big impact on our industry. So we get involved in a lot of other issues, but I know the topic is licensure, but we also get involved in a lot of financial trust related type issues. What you pre-need sales type issues, those come up all the time. So there's a lot, but anyway, that's that in a nutshell. That's really what I see as far as some small changes in licensure. But I guess I don't see any really big changes coming. And again, I think, it's the industry is really holding on firm to the licensure. And, is that the problem? I don't know. I think that we would like to see it easier to recruit quality people to our profession. And it is tough. It's tough with the licensure requirements. It's definitely tough. And I think we're losing a lot of people because of it. So that's.
And our last panelist is Dr. Harry Close II.
I think I should have been first and get it out the way. Let me say good afternoon. Thank you for this great opportunity. Let me do a quick disclaimer. I'm a licensee that grew up in the funeral business, never ever wanted to do it because at 16 years old, I couldn't get a date. And so I went into the hotel business. So I guess I'm selling a different type of bid, right? I am a former regulator in the state of Maryland for 9 years, 5 years as president. I also was president of the conference board that regulate the 50 states regulators, as well as the 10 provinces and 3 territories in Canada. Former educator in mortuary school. So this is going to be a great discussion. Let me just open up. Education is important. Let me talk as an embalmer. I did not want to be an embalmer. In the state of Maryland, it's a dual. It's called a mortician, which is both licenses. Happened to be my gift. I failed in mortuary school. My professor said, let me call you a bust, which means you failed. So the next semester I mastered it, and I'm now teaching embalming across the country, particularly in Africa, to those nations that are just exploring this aspect. But let me talk about the embalmer, then I'll talk about the funeral director. Without the embalmer, without that human body, without that body called the cadaver, which is those of us who are going to donate our bodies for science, there would be no licensed physicians, no matter what your specialty. There will be no licensed podiatrists. There'll be no licensed dentists. There'll be no licensed paramedics, EMTs, nurses, in some areas, midwives and practitioners. There would be no massage therapists, depending on the school. There will be no physical therapists. There'll be no chiropractors. There'll be no pharmacists, depending on the school. And there will be no radiologists and technologies for MIR, and even some of the athlete trainers. So without the embalmer, this nation would not be able to do what they are supposed to be certified. So in some areas, it is imperative to have an embalmer. We just went through COVID-19, and all states were looking for an embalmer, no matter where your jurisdiction was, in order to help those areas that were hit. New York, New Jersey, all on the east coast, all the original 13 colonies. So here's the issue. A funeral director has two parts role. The funeral director is to make arrangements and cover the funeral. My colleague and I were talking, Caressa, yesterday, and I said, well, what happens if that person wants to correct the body? Now, she works for a corporation. So it's a little different philosophy because it's a larger corporation and they have larger people. Well, a small operation, what we call a small house, you better know how to do everything. I agree and disagree, but most women are excellent in the funeral industry. The first funeral directors were women. I can give you some scriptorial things, but I don't want to offend anyone biblically, but read the last book, the last chapter of the first book of the Bible, last chapter, and you'll see the only 3 words embalmed mentioned in the text. Only time. Most effective women, if you go to the New Testament, I'm going to get in the Bible. I'm a pastor as well. Bear with me. I got to do. Women were jobs was to wash and anoint the body, not a man. It is natural for a woman to do what she does. The reason why most women couldn't get a job because the men were chauvinistic of their time. You could be a licensee, but you're only going to answer the phone and be the secretary. Some of the best women I know who are embalmers are in the state of Maryland and across the country. For those in my association across the country, because I know I have my members watching, they're excellent embalmers. Now, I do agree that as a former educator, I had issues with some of my students. No matter what your ethnicity, no matter what your gender, you're going to know how to do this body. This is a health issue. I also taught first year and second year med students at 2 major universities in Maryland, hospitals. I won't call their names, but there's only 2 in the state of Baltimore. And don't go to any hospital in March or October because the R's are working, talking about those who are training, and you might not know that they don't know the human body. I'm sorry to say that to you. I'm sitting next to Renee. I'm kind of laughing because 2 of the cases she mentioned, I was the executive director at 27, 28 years old on some of those cases of the third-party casket sale. So I always say I took the other end to the funeral director because that's my job was. But I realized I tell funeral directors, anyone can bring a casket. You can make your own casket. You don't just take the daggone, I don't say what I really say, but take the casket, okay? I think it's very interesting of this discussion because my first thought when I heard about the education, I thought we were talking about increasing the education, which I do think we do in some areas. It seems to, in order for us to get certain people, we want to less the education requirement. And here's the thing, the funeral director is the most, depending on what community, in some communities, they're the top 10% of that profession or top 10 in your community, in the African-American community and people of color, they're the top 1 or 2. So the funeral director is very imperative to the movement of that community. I don't want anyone who doesn't really understand some basic issues. We talked about this yesterday. I'm here, education of lawyers. One thing you learned is how to read a word problem because a comma, a but, or thereof, or thereas makes a difference in contents, correct? But if you take that same concept to any other profession in the United States, the average American cannot read a word problem. So now we want to make the testing, I'm talking testing now. We want to have true and false to make an answer. And those same people who don't comprehend the statutes and regulations are dealing with your mothers and fathers and your children at the time where they're supposed to protect. Now, my colleague here, the professor who's an expert, didn't say to you, depending on what state board you go to, is it of the funeral law, is it of the health code, or is it the business law? Because if you're under the health code, that is a whole different way you have to deal with that family than under the business law. Because under the business law, it's only 3 agencies that oversee that state board. It's either going to be EPA, it's going to might be OSHA, and the business law. State of Maryland is a health code. So I'm regulated by 24 agencies, 16 federal and the remaining 9 in the state of Maryland. So it's a different approach. If you go to Pennsylvania, Commonwealth, Pennsylvania, the state board doesn't even make the decisions. It's the attorney general that tells them what to do. So are we really protecting the consumer by the 2 individuals that should be helping you, the funeral director and a mortician? And if mother is not looking like themselves, I don't have time to send them to a holding room. I better make that correction. I'm gonna ask you, please step out. Give me 5 minutes and I'm gonna do some things. I won't tell you what we really do, but we make the correction based on what you see. But what you see is not what I saw when mother came in. And there's a whole different perspective. We can't even take pictures anymore to show that family how that person looked coming to us and how they look now because it's under the Privacy Act. I got in the HIPAA, in some aspect, I got to make sure I don't put my staff in a real bad issue. So the funeral director is supposed to be dealing with the red flag. Only the lawyers are doing the red flag, because Congress said that funeral directors can't deal with it right now, but we need to have someone to protect you. So all my funeral directors and embalmers are bonded because you're giving your personal information to. Now, why is he talking all this logging, this information? Because that's more what people don't realize. The funeral director is supposed to give you that information so that you can make an intelligent decision. You should know what your budget is. Don't tell me how you're paying. Don't even provide the insurance policy until after I quote or the cemetery quotes what they want. And here's another thing. Most people go to the cemetery, no disrespect to my colleagues who represent the cemetery, that you go to the cemetery first and you buy all your goods. If that cemetery doesn't have a funeral home, then you go to your funeral home. And by the time you go to your funeral home, you have already made decisions that the funeral home is trying to point in. I have your loved one, but you went somewhere else. I don't care if you buy all the merchandise. I'm just might be myself. You can't pay, you have to pay my service charge. But in the process of my service charge, there's some responsibility that I have to make sure that you're protected. That's how important it is, why you can't go from one jurisdiction to the next. And I'm going to go to Tucson when I retire. I just left Tucson Canyon Ranch in December. Best 5 days I've had. I don't usually plug places, but it was the best 5 days that they really helped me. I'm going to Tucson, even though they have tarantulas going around, okay? But there's a reason why each jurisdiction, you have to have those regulations. And yeah, we had that little, what's that young lady? We had a little discussion about Colorado and California. They don't regulate the licensee, they regulate the facility. Yes, the facility should have been regulated, but I blame the General Assembly. And like my colleagues already said, it's always when there's a crisis, then the governments want to run. Kane, I love Barbara. I learned how I do 60% cremation. I went from 2%, 9 years to 60% cremation, but you're going to have some type of service. The panel before, the colleague was talking about people don't want to see the body, depends on what culture you come from. You know, 27% of my business is from the majority community, the Anglo-Saxon, then another 9% Hindu, then I have another 9%, a mixture of the Muslim community. Some want to see it, don't. My families who are Italian or who are Chinese, African-American, Hispanic, they want to see and touch that body. It has been proven through psychologists and sociologists, those who do not touch that body, who do not recognize that death, is 10 to 15 years later, they're trying to figure out why I'm having this issue, because you never dealt with the death of that person that was most closely to you. So, you know, when we really start looking at these items, the funeral director is your family member. I could tell a family that I've served almost, I tell you, my family had a business from 1932 to 78, and my uncle destroyed it. And then I started my own business. I'm 26 years in. I can tell my children the history of that family that we served. I've seen people grow. So the funeral director becomes a part of your family. They know your history better than you. So should there be some diverse, I agree. In Maryland, we have it. You know how we got it? Because Governor O'Malley, who's now Social Security Commissioner, told our state board when I was president, the Muslim community is gonna have its license. Now you get the license, the regulations to match that license. So in Maryland, we do have funeral directors only, but you can only use that license in Maryland, but the General Assembly requires that you go to mortuary school, and the only class you don't take is actually the practicum in the lab. I am a component of education. I must be honest and transparent, and I'm gonna end in another minute. I have 2 doctors, 3 masters, and a couple of bachelors, and the hardest degree I received was a associate degree in mortuary science because I knew nothing about science. I couldn't see it, a cell, but I ended up learning how this human machine is so vital that someone has to make sure that they prepare and make sure your last loved one looks like. And as I mentioned, we educate all the ones that you go to the hospital. It's a funeral director, an embalmer that helps them get their license. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Harry. I was going to ask you the first question, and the first question was, would you tell me why a funeral director will be better at his or her job by being an embalmer if they have no intention of being an embalmer? Now, I listened to everything you said, and I was just looking for the answer to that question. And there was a point at which you talked about the fact that, oh, I looked at your mother and she wasn't quite right. And so I was going to go touch, you said that go away for a minute. I'm going to touch up your mother, and then you come back in. And actually, I did, as Caitlin mentioned in her talk, coin the term ready to embalm. And I came up with that term because there was a sunset report for the Arizona regulations, and the sunset report basically recommended getting rid of the requirements that would make all funeral directors be embalmers. And their response was basically that same argument, that basically every funeral director has to be trained as an embalmer, because even if they don't routinely do embalming, there may be those situations in which they need to just touch up a body. Then if you're an economist, you'd ask the question, well, is the benefits of that worth all the different costs and the fact that we've got labor shortages and so forth? So I think that was your answer too, but I may have missed something else in that that was a reason why funeral directors will be better funeral directors by having embalming training, despite the fact that they don't routinely do embalms.
I will make it quite short. Depending on the structure of, can I use SEI or any corporation? They're a bigger operation, but when you're dealing with the smaller operation, which the average funeral home is only 5 employees or less across America. They don't, people don't get it. The larger firms are rare, but the average is 5. I'll even go up to 10. So you need to have some people on that staff that know that. So I will be honest, I don't make arrangements anymore. Not because I don't want to, but my staff kicks me out. So I understand having just a funeral director who's some areas called an arranger. I can relate to that, but that's why I'm the supervisor mortician in the state of Maryland. That means if anyone messes up, I get hit, and I got hit about a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago. One of my staff members made an error, and since I'm supervising mortician, I hit my record. So in that process, I said, sure, I have no problem with dual license. Now we just let the conference board, the International Conference Board, the Funeral Examiner Board, which I mentioned I was present, they discussed that argument. Usually the American board that regulates the education, they didn't want dual licenses because it didn't go into their statute. They're going to address it, but they brought up. But here's the catch. It depends on what the statutes are in your state. And anyone who deals with a statute knows you do not want to open that statute. We're in Maryland's Comar 7. I don't want to open up that statute because then everything's fair play. But, I can see someone being a funeral director. To my colleagues online, I know I'll defend that at our next meeting in April. But we are funeral directors and morticians, so some of our members are just funeral directors. So I accept that. But you need somebody better be a bomb on that. Sorry to say.
If you look at that map, so the dual license business, I don't think is a panacea. Because if you look at that map, in my presentation, that was done by another economist, but I agree with that economist that did the map. And a lot of those states were dual license states, but the requirements for a funeral director license were so similar to the license for an embalmer that virtually everybody, if you have to do 2 years of an associate degree that has training in embalming as part of it, if you have dual licenses, but you require them to get a mortuary science degree, they'll end up choosing to be embalmers anyway, right? And so you have the dual license in some of those states. I've looked at it in the past. In some of those states that have dual licenses, you'll find that if the collection of funeral directors, embalmer, and funeral directors and morticians, or funeral directors and embalmer slash morticians, it will be 95% that choose to be the mortician. And you only have like 5% that end up being. And so you've got to make you need a dual license and have less requirements for the occupation that doesn't have a scientific skill associated with it, which is embalming, right?
So the question I would say to you, when we write this funeral director only, is that license be able to go across state lines? Because that's what the real issue is. If I'm a mortician and I'm a boat, I can now go across state lines because the national board allows me to go take the exam at somewhere else.
Right.
So if the American Board of Funeral Education, which is regulated by Department of Education, doesn't get that to be changed in Washington, because that's where the real big issue is. Will the Department of Education accept the premise that's already set in other people's statutes? You can't get a change. So it's bigger than just us giving a title of just having one licensee. You have to now deal with the federal government on the other end. Even though the federal government doesn't, it regulates, I'm going to say this, the funeral rule. And for those who are listening, the funeral rule, Federal Trade Commission funeral rule, which is under review, started in 1984, only regulates the funeral home. It doesn't regulate any other segments of the industry. But when the media comes across, they only come to the funeral home. And that's why I'm on record saying, let the funeral cover everybody. Even in cremation, there's only 13 states, maybe Maryland made it 13 states in 2013 that regulate cremation. And when Noble, Georgia came about, it was an issue. You know, I thought every state in the United States would regulate the cremation process. Now, it's a process. It's not the final disposition. Thank you, Barbara, because I've improved on how I present that. So I'm just saying, you know, when you start looking at different segments, just don't label the funeral home. The funeral rule only covers us. It doesn't cover your cemetery, your crematory, or any other entity. But when it hits the media, every funeral director is on alert because that's the perception. And it could be the cemetery, because the cemetery is under the business law.
So I want to ask Caressa a question. Remember I had that graph that showed you that the number of funeral directors in Arizona hasn't changed a twit, even though the population has gone up by 33%, right? And so I went to your website, and your website had all sorts of interesting stuff, including that the Service Corporation International had 42 facilities in Phoenix. Those would be funeral homes, cemeteries, cremation providers, and so forth. And so I thought it would be helpful. I think part of that is due to organizations like SCI and the way that they use funeral directors, and the way that funeral directors are being used in a more intensive way than they are at other funeral homes that are sort of standalone, say family-owned funeral homes. So can you just talk a bit about how SCI uses their funeral directors in a way that's different than sort of traditional family-owned funeral homes?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I mean, I go to every one of your facilities, and if I go to a family-owned funeral home, they often have an about that I can click on, and it will give me the staff, and it will tell me who the funeral directors are at that particular location. But if I go to SCI, Dignity Memorial facilities, they don't usually have that, right? And I think it's because their funeral directors aren't necessarily attached only to that facility, are they? Can't they be moved around to your
Yes.
satellite?
Yes, they can. And depending on, we will use resources and share those resources. And sometimes if we have a really large funeral and we need to borrow from some of our other facilities that may not have a service going on, then we would borrow our employees for that. Yes, and we do have that ability to do that
Right.
because of our size.
And so I'm assuming if I had the data, I'd find that your funeral directors are handling more funerals than a typical funeral director at a family-owned funeral home, right?
I-
Because you're moving them around to where you need them,
Right.
right? And you also, I assume, have centralized embalming facilities, right?
Yes, we do.
Where your embalmers are also being kept more active.
Right.
And so one of the reasons that I think that in, say, Arizona, that you can have a constant number of funeral directors with a rising population, well, one of them is the fact that cremation has grown so much, and you probably don't need the labor for a typical cremation. I know it's cremation with memorialization,
I think
but
I think we do need the labor, and I
Okay.
think that's what I thought your question was going to be. I do think it's because it's staying flat because people are retiring. I mean, we know that a lot of our staff is retiring, they're at retirement age, and the low number of folks coming out of mortuary school, and let's face it, the low number of people that even want to be in this profession. And that's why I think it's flat. I mean,
Okay.
and we know there's just like other occupations, there's a 3% increase of need every year. And you look at those numbers of how many jobs are sitting out there that are available. I think that's why it's flat. That's what I thought your question was going to be.
Okay, well, that's fine. That's good. I also looked at, and it's consistent with, I also looked at your site and for job openings.
Well, thank you
Uh,
for visiting.
Yeah, you had something like 15 job openings in Arizona for funeral directors and all sorts
Sure.
of other things. Then I went to Missouri. Remember Missouri? They had, you could either become a funeral director by taking 1 year of mortuary college and 1 year or 1 year of apprenticeship,
Yeah.
right? As opposed to Arizona, where it takes 4 years or 3 to 4 years. And I went to your website in Missouri, and I found there you were advertising for funeral apprenticeships in funeral directing. And so I thought, hey, that's great. They're leveraging the universal law because they can get somebody in Missouri to come work at one of their funeral homes, be a licensed or an apprentice at their funeral home. Then they become a funeral director. They spend 1 year as a funeral director in Missouri. Then they go off to Arizona.
You're on to us.
Yeah. So with Renee, I wanted to ask, you know, I think the Institute for Justice has done wonderful work, right? And they basically cause, as you suggested, in Alabama, the legislature just looked at your case and said, we're going to let non-funeral directors sell caskets. I was involved in a case in Minnesota where your group sued on behalf of someone who didn't want to put an embalming room in their satellite facility. And that ended happily with the state legislature changing it so that if you own a central facility that does have an embalming room, your satellite facilities don't have to, right? And so the Institute for Justice has been successful at nudging the edges and nudging some reforms in the edges. But it's really tough to go directly after the requirement that all funeral directors have to be embalmers. And I was involved in a case in Pennsylvania that tried to do it. And we won at the district level, and then we lost at the appeal level. I didn't really have that much to do with it, but the lawyers did, right? And they ran smack dab into what principle in the law, which I'd like you to explain. And because I think that's what makes it so hard to use the legal system to go directly after things like the embalming room requirement and the requirement that all funeral directors need to be embalmers.
Yeah, sure. I think you're talking about the rational basis
Yes.
test. Is that it?
Yes,
Okay,
that's
great.
exactly it. So you
So-
understood my question.
Yeah,
That was a
did.
better question than what I gave Caressa.
Yeah, so first of all, I'll answer your question, but first, I actually worked on that case too, because when those litigants unfortunately lost at the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. They wanted to do a cert petition to the US Supreme Court to see if the Supreme Court would take the case. And they couldn't continue to pay their current lawyers. And I don't know if I said before, but IJ represents all of our clients for free. You know, we're a nonprofit and our clients don't have to pay us. And so we took the case over and did the cert petition to try to get that case up to the Supreme Court. And I worked on that and drafted that. But then, of course, the court didn't take it, because then all of you might actually know about that case. So that was the first time I encountered Professor Harrington's work. But the reason why they lost that case is something called the rational basis test. And I don't know how many of you in the room are lawyers or law students, but you know, we're protecting people's constitutional rights, and the Constitution explicitly protects a lot of rights in the Bill of Rights. You've got free speech, freedom of religion, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, the right to bear arms, all of these rights that are listed in the Constitution. And they get real protection from judges. Judges care about these rights. And you can go into court and say the government's violating those rights, you get serious attention. But if there's a right that's not listed in the Constitution, like the right to earn an honest living in the occupation of your choice, judges don't treat those rights the same. Even though it, you know, since the very beginning, everybody knows that you have that right, and it's protected under the Due Process Clause. But judges apply what is called the rational basis test. There just has to be a rational basis for the government to restrict that right, and then it's fine. So sometimes in the most extreme instances, the judges can just make up a reason, you know, just make something up. Maybe they were caring about this, and so they passed the law, and so it's perfectly fine. But these cases, especially the cases about casket sales, it is just so obvious that there's no rational reason why someone shouldn't be able to sell a box, that these are kind of the thin edge of the wedge for rational basis cases. And we've had a ton of success with them in promoting economic liberty. But sadly, these cases are really, really hard to win. And so we've, you know, IJ's done a ton of great work, not just in the death care industry, but in other fields as well, trying to advance economic liberty, but we're up against the rational basis test, so it's very difficult.
One of the things I was amazed at was learning a bit about the rational basis test is that pure economic protectionism, according to several of the circuits, is a perfectly rational reason to have anti-competitive laws.
Right.
And so that's the reason I thought it would go to the Supreme Court, because I think the Supreme Court could make a decision as to whether purely anti-competitive regulations can be justified as rational laws for states to enact, right? I can understand, and it's going to be hard. You know, Harry and I may disagree a bit about the requirement that all funeral directors be embalmers, but at least an argument which is more narrow than what you believe, I think, that the argument that all funeral directors need to be embalmers because there are instances where you need to touch up a body. That is a positive benefit, right? That isn't just simply saying we want this law, this regulation because we want protection in terms of the competition of the marketplace. And so I think that is very difficult to attack via the court system because of the rational basis test. And that's the reason I give some hope to universal licensing laws, because they potentially can undermine the most stringent regulations. So do you all have questions you could ask other people on the panel, or should we open it up to people in the... Okay, so why don't we open it up to people? Okay, so I always give deference to the moderator of previous panels for the first question.
I want to ask about something that Renee brought up, right? So this is kind of coming at the regulation stuff sideways now. That like home funeral advocates, right, have really struggled with the idea of licensure, right, and standardized training for home funeral guides, right? And I just want to understand, I just want to hear like what your perspective is thinking about regulations and licensure, like what your thoughts are about home funeral guides, like the home funeral.
Sure. So I'll repeat the question for those of you who are online. What do we think of home funeral guides, and how should home funeral guides be regulated? And maybe I'm the wrong person to answer this first, because I'm a crazy libertarian, and I think that home funeral guides are speaking for a living, and they're not subject to the rational basis test. This is free speech. This gets real protection in court, and I think that they, depending on exactly what they're doing, no licensure, no regulation, they should be able to talk to people about death, because that's all they're doing. They're providing social and emotional support that, frankly, people have done for each other for thousands of years without interference from the government, without some sort of overarching system interfering with what they're doing. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, let me look coming from a different perspective. In the state of Maryland, we have a lot of individuals. They're not called home funeral guides. They're called funeral consultants. They actually call the funeral homes and start negotiating on behalf of the family, which they don't have the written authorization from the next of kin, which is called PRD, primary right disposition. The way it's being described in this way, everyone has someone that guides them. Go to this funeral home. This is who they did well. That's not really what the issue is. The issue is that particular consultant, you want to say funeral home guide, is actually acting in the place of a funeral director, then turns around and goes to the cemetery and does the same thing. And when it comes down to the reality, they're sometimes not even the person who's in charge, who's the next of kin, and they have made all these negotiations on behalf. So the state of Maryland addressed it, that there's a form of a license, but it's funeral director. That's where that funeral director law will come in for someone like this, that you're still a funeral director, you can make arrangements and you can be present, but there's a kind of fine line of ethics where a person's personally doing it and now they're publicly doing it without a license, and it's aiding and abetting. And some of the state laws have very clear about aiding and abetting a license, because most people forget funeral directors and morticians are federally licensed. But here's what I'm saying. If you're following Penny on, I'll use Maryland. If you use all the different codes under the funeral rule, which still governs me, they're governing that. As long as the law, your state law doesn't supersede it. If it's in your state law, the federal government law, the funeral rule, and we just saw the Wall Street Business Journal, even though some of those items were so old that they hit the violation, but violation. I'll just say to my colleagues online, about your general price list. Please tell people what your cost is. How many times can we keep saying the same thing? And I put mine on my general price. Put it on the website and just call it a day. The public has the right to know your cost. We all go on our phones and we look for pricing, and pricing might be for some decisions. But at the same time, making my point and listening, I have no problem you personally doing it. But if you start doing it publicly like that and you advertising it, our Attorney General was very adamant about protection of the consumer, because then there's another way the Muslim community used to do that as well. They will call a funeral home. The funeral home has to bring the remains to them, but they sold, and now all mosques, let me say it for disclaimer, they own cemetery plots, and you had to go through the mosque to buy the cemetery plot, and then some of them would charge a fee. So that's why the state of Maryland made them become funeral directors and morticians, because they were transacting business and there was no safeguard for the public. And that's what the thing is. It's about the funeral, it's about the safeguard for you, because you're in an emotional state. And even though you think Mr. Smith, stuff better be in order. And I'll say that nicely and small. So there's some people now, and federal prison for not following the law.
Some
I
of-
saw a general way up in the
oh,
corner
okay.
too.
Never mind.
So we have that person there, okay.
Hey, thank you so much for this talk. I really enjoyed it. It's really fascinating. So I'm kind of interested in relationship between the funeral director licensing statutes on the one hand, and then religious clergy on the other, right? So one group of people who has historically been the people comforting families after death have been clergy, like imams, rabbis, pastors. And it seems like kind of sort of Renee's case, that they might too fall into the sweep of these funeral directing statutes. So it might be the case that someone wants to perform a home funeral and get advice from a pastor about how the funeral should be conducted. And I guess my question is, is that something that Renee is happening, or what is your view after that? And then
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I think it's an important one.
Can you
and-
summarize the question?
Oh, yes, of course. So what about clergy and people who, do the things that funeral directors do for religious reasons? Do they get swept up by these licensing laws? And if so, is that something that could be, would they have strong legal claims? Is that a fair summary of your question? Yeah. IJ doesn't do religious liberty claims, and so my knowledge of this area is actually kind of limited, but I think that there probably are people who are encountering those issues, and I've heard of a few of them. Like in Minnesota, they recently put a moratorium on green cemeteries, and it was because of like a religious green cemetery, because like Muslims and Jewish people don't embalm bodies, and so a lot of them have green cemeteries. And so the religious aspect is very much tied up in that, and there's a big controversy right now going on there because of that aspect of it. But since we don't litigate those religious liberty claims, I know very little about them, but I know that they're very strong because religious liberty is one of those rights that is explicitly spelled out in the Constitution. And so I think that they would have very strong claims.
I'll just comment too that primarily, they're considered religious, not for profit, and they are not regulated the same as a funeral home. And so they really, just like she said, it falls out of that regulation and even legal. So they could do that, what you said. They could meet with families and help them, and they would not be under the regulation.
Yeah, and because of that, we don't see very many people come to us with those kind of issues because I think a lot of them are just exempted from these kind of laws.
I have seen many, I don't see that many, I don't do the Jewish community, but in the Muslim community, the rabbi, the imam would not come to the funeral home. But in the Protestant community, you might see the minister sitting at the table with the family. But every pastor is gonna, religious leader is gonna direct their members to do something, depending on if they have a relationship with a funeral home or not. But just to, some things, like I said, please know your budget before you go. Don't tell them your budget. Don't give them the insurance policy. Listen, and then tell them what you have. And every funeral home, even no matter how big you are, if you have a certain budget, yeah, we'll work within that budget, but you're not getting this, or this. So that's the other option. But just a disclaimer, in the Jewish community and the Muslim community, if they are now going out of the country, they must be embalmed. It used to be dry ice. The airline since COVID doesn't accept dry ice. So there are some cases in the Jewish community that they are embalmed. They usually get a Gentile to embalm, and then they will ship them. So those I do 4 months. I do all their embalming, and if they're going to go out of the country, and then they'll get washed and shrouded properly. But can I just say this for those attorneys who might one day come before a funeral state board? As a regulator, it is not the regulator's position to argue the statutes or regulations. We are just following the regulations that the governor signed and the General Assembly or senators and delegates or representatives have signed. So if you ever go before the state board, helping a individual that mostly the state board knows they're already guilty, because we're gonna ask the question 3 different times. And those funeral directors here and online, if you call before state board, please get an attorney. It is a fool that doesn't have an attorney to speak on your behalf. So I always say to those colleagues, every state board has 2 or 3 attorneys that come to every meeting. Get you one of those who knows the statutes and the regulations, because when you come before us, I'm not here to argue Title VII. That's not my position. My position as a regulator is to implement the protection of the citizens of the state that I'm chosen and selected by the governor and confirmed by the Senate to protect those citizens. So just, for the young attorney, great minds that's in this room, and you have changed my perception. Last night, I had a different perspective.
Yeah.
I want to thank all those young, bright minds, because normally when I meet attorneys, when I was president of the state board, I would ask this question: are we going to have a conversation, or are we just going to talk? Because if we're just going to talk, you're wasting my time and yours. But if we're going to have a conversation that we know they're guilty, but this is how we will even get them out of it. So I like to say, last night's dinner changed my perspective of all those young people that were there. Thank you so much. I feel great that I know I'm at Wake Forest Law School, which I'm privileged to know that I had some type of impact on these great minds. And thank your parents for their kindness. They were so kind to me last night. See, you can change your funeral director stocks.
Any more questions? There we go.
That's a great question. So her question was, is there a difference between bringing these type of claims, specifically in the death care industry, in state versus federal court? And are state courts or federal courts more receptive to economic liberty? And that's kind of a complicated question, because all of the cases that we've been talking about have been in federal court. And the reason why is because these casket cases and the death care cases have been the thin edge of the wedge. They've been a way that we think we can bring these types of claims in front of judges and courts that might otherwise be hostile, because traditionally it is more difficult to win an economic liberty claim in federal court. But we've really been swinging for the fences with these kinds of cases. But the case that I just filed in January, and I'm glad that someone gave me an opportunity to talk about it, is in state court. And that's because it's a property rights case involving a green cemetery. So there's a couple in Western Michigan who want to open up a conservation burial ground. I was so glad that someone brought that up earlier, because it's really, it's an increasingly popular way to honor the dead. And this couple has this beautiful 20-acre property, forested, and one of them is a botanist. And so he wants to use his botany skills to preserve the forest, but also have a green cemetery and have this be a way to preserve this property. And so the couple was working through the local regulatory process with the township, trying to get a special use permit under the zoning code, doing everything that they were supposed to do. They got health department approval. They were going through all the necessary steps. And then the township said, wait a second, we don't actually want you. And in fact, we're going to go even further, and we're going to ban all cemeteries. Like we're literally not allowing any more cemeteries in our township. We're done, go away. So it really took them off guard, and they're very dedicated to what they were doing, and they were very frustrated. So they came to us and we filed a suit on their behalf in state court. And the reason why we did that is, one, it's property rights are very kind of local issues, and it's very difficult to bring those cases in federal court. But also we thought that there was room to make an economic liberty claim under the Michigan Constitution, because often state constitutions provide more protection for economic liberty than the federal Constitution. So that case just got filed. It's in the very early stages, and we'll see how successful it is. Good question.
Good question. Right. Middle disease. Mhm.
There is so much confusion about funeral law and funeral across the state about unembalmed officers, being brought across state lines, all of that kind of stuff. I've called like several, I've called several different funerals. So many times they are not aware. What can
That's
be done?
true.
And we talk about the protections of public consumers. If the consumer doesn't want it, I mean, how are Jewish people and Muslims been dealing with death for thousands of years when they're not able to do an embalming?
Well, first you can view unembalmed bodies. It's a limitation. But for just to answer your question that you just read, since COVID-19, those two particular Jewish community and Muslim community, when being shipped out of the United States, has to be embalmed on the receiving end. You're right. Coming in, there's some countries that we know COVID was high. I couldn't believe the United States was accepting those remains, but because most people forget, the skin has so many pores. It was an airborne virus, but that's another subject matter. The virus is still alive. It's been proven after death. We lost in the National Funeral Directors and Mortician Association, which is majority African-American funeral homes celebrating 100 years in September this year. We lost 400 funeral directors during COVID. So, and you will not, let me finish, you will not see that in print because the CDC was instructed not to keep the records of COVID-19. And if this country had known how many funeral directors were dying, their staff, during COVID, you thought you had a pandemic, you would have had a real craziness. Because everyone, and I only talk about how many funerals that I had to attend of colleagues across this country because I was national president. And I will agree to disagree with, but I know how it's impact the African-American community. And okay. 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 We will kindly agree to disagree because I had 30 cases. I took 30 kits. I paid for the kits. And that in there swabbing the nose and mouth was still alive after the embalming. So you do what you do on the front end, which I recognize and I appreciate you, but on the back end was not really given the same type of perspective. So we'll agree to disagree on that. Same thing, just like I made a statement that right now you will not see COVID-19. I had 3 cases last week and all of them said it thoracic, something, not virus, but it's not saying COVID until you test the body. Then the ME says, oh, that's a COVID case. Well, it's not on the death certificate. But that's another argument. That's not what we're not here for. And I get it. I really do get it. So here's what I'll say to answer your second question. That body does not have, if that funeral director in the receiving state, if they have a courtesy card, they can come across state line and get that body, take it back, and has to be filed. In a case that is contagious, it has to be embalmed going. And it's really been emphasis since COVID-19. Even though Any funeral director can come across the line if they got the proper documentation. In the state of Maryland, I got 400 letters in my file because I had to sign death certificates when I was president. Well, I was really on the board for 9 years to protect the family because they couldn't get the death certificate because you have to be a licensee. The establishment has to be licensed in Maryland in order for the death certificate to be processed. The only other option, if the family goes themselves, not have a funeral director involved, they have to get a letter from the medical examiners, take it to Vital Records, let Vital Records certify the death certificate, and then they can take the death certificate and go to the hospital and you can claim your loved one. That is the process. And I do agree that some of my colleagues do not read. They do not comprehend the law, and the consumer knows the law better than they do. And that's one of my major pet peeves. And I am saying that, and you guys know who are watching, I do say that. You must read, R-E-A-D, comprehend what you read. And if you're not the compliant person, get the secretary or the janitor. If they comprehend what they just read, then they can be the compliance officer for your business. And I will agree with you with that statement. I'm still going.
You're still.
Okay, so I think we've saturated the audience with our information.
What a
and
way
so-
to end. What a
yeah,
way to end.
And a great panel, and thanks so much for being here.